Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. So I'm Wilfried Laforge. I'm the CEO of this young publishing house called Enceladus Press. And Pauline, who is right there, and Pauline in the high art. She's delighted to be in New York today for the launch of François' book. And these for several reasons. The first, and perhaps the simplest reason, is that we are deeply touched by the trust François placed in us for his great first book to publish, which will be soon available everywhere thanks to our distribution by the MIT Press. We are a young publishing house, and he believed in this project from the very beginning, so we're very grateful. But beyond this initial gesture of trust, what we want to highlight is, of course, the content of the book itself and the way it resonates with our editorial vision. Enceladus Press has chosen to focus on philosophy, aesthetics, history, that on one hand remain grounded in the concrete. What I mean by that is we want to talk about works that begin with close analysis of singular artistic practices, that learn to listen to them, that immerse themselves in their experience. And on the other hand, we are actually committed to works that remain attuned to the voices of artists themselves. Listening to philosophy itself is a powerful first step toward the kind of commitment that is ours. And this book could not be more fitting being for the story of our publishing house and for what we're thinking tonight. Thank you. Well, so Pauline, we started that project, so an associate professor of philosophy at the Sorbonne in Paris. We'll present the book more precisely.
Thank you. I'm sitting on the microphone.
Raise the mic.
Okay, sorry, I'm sure. Okay. So, thank you very much, Wilfried. Thank you all for being here tonight. So, I would like to begin by situating myself to talk about this book. I speak here both as a philosopher and as a researcher on sound environments. So my work lies in musical aesthetics and sound arts, and I work on sound within the history of philosophy. My research asks how music and sound shape philosophical thought, and how listening can inform our thought through a prism that differs from vision and representation. I also study the sonic texture of our environment and how technologies of listening and recording shape our relation to this world. So obviously, thinking with our ears resonates very deeply with both of these interests. So first, a few words about the philosophical stance of this book. Philosophy has never been silent about sound, though its relation to it has always been very ambivalent. François reminds us of this in showing how decisive philosophical moments unfold through the ear. Plato feared music's power to seduce and to bypass rational order, revealing philosophy's unease toward resonance as a force that escapes logos. Rousseau, in contrast, grounded human community in song and melody. Nietzsche placed music at the very origin of tragedy and made resonance a foundational concept for philosophy. Sound, we see, has a very critical role in the history of philosophy, and we could go further and say, for example, with Adorno, that sound art music is not only an object for philosophy, but a practice of philosophy itself, a seismograph registering the fractures of modernity. So this is not a continuous narrative, but a set of tensions, of reversals and fractures, and I think thinking with our ears asks us to hear them as such. So for my own research, I would add that these tensions always turn on the question of vulnerability. Does sound destabilize the sovereignty of reason? Or does it allow philosophy to resonate more truthfully with the world? A second crucial gesture of François' book is a critique of the metaphysics of the voice. It's a very important thesis here. Western thought has long idealized voice as the guarantor of presence, authenticity, and immediacy. Even when deconstructed, the voice still carries a sort of aura of truth. But sound is not reducible to the voice. It includes stutters, murmurs, silences, hesitations, and noises. Already, for example, in Lucretius, voice appears not as a transcendental medium, but as atoms colliding, an acoustic phenomenon among others. So to listen, then, is not to discover pure presence, but to confront impurity. Here, my own work converges with Françoise. Listening is not a transparent act of access, but an exposure. The ear opens up to contingency, to noise, to interruptions. It cannot master. To sound our world is to recognize its material fragility of sound against the illusion of immediacy. So from there, François shifts the focus. It is not only about philosophy on sound, but about listening to philosophy itself. And I think this is one of the most significant steps of this book. Arguments matter, but so do rhythm, tone, cadence in philosophy. A philosophical text is not mute, it resonates. Derrida's accent, inseparable from his voice, was part of his philosophical gesture. It unfolds in critique of the voice. Sartre's piano practice revealed how his thought vibrated with musicality and improvisation. Montaigne's essays, with their layered digressions and quotations, are themselves polyphonic texts, a skeptical sound mix, one could say. So as I was reading these pages, I had a powerful feeling of intimacy towards philosophy, and I would say towards philosophers. Not the intimacy of schools, thoughts, or contexts, but of a life that has a passive aspect in the practice of philosophy itself, that is exposed to sound as ambience and events. So this comes into sharper focus for the case of Montaigne, I think. As François shows, his essays are full of interruptions and quotations, revisions and strata. He even confesses he has many voices as well as many strings. Read with our ears, Montaigne gives not a unified cogito, but a noisy chorus, very unstable and open. Maybe here I would like to ask a question to François. After, is this polyphony an active practice, or is it a form of passivity into philosophy itself? So this leads naturally to the voice of philosophy when spoken. Philosophy has always been read aloud, performed, and listened to. Reading aloud reveals the poses, the tonalities, the inflections of a text. It makes us hear that philosophy is not only meaning, but resonance. François' own experience with radio, I think, illustrates this beautifully, and I think this experience is very important to understand what led you to this book. To read philosophy on the airways is never neutral. You have a tone, an accent, rhythm always color the text. It shows us that philosophy is inseparable from the materiality of its voicing. And maybe if we have time, could you develop this point of broadcasting philosophy in France led you to this. So finally, from the perspective of sound environments, this book resonates in other direction also. Listening is never abstract. It is always situated within acoustic conditions that are historical, social, and environmental. So today, these conditions are changing dramatically. Silences disappear, species fall silent, urban noise saturates the ear. So these remarks are common and very well known, but what I find as much interesting is that at the same time, new layers of sound proliferate. Earbuds, podcasts, social media, a schizophrenic reality, say Murray Schaeffer, where sounds are cut off from their sources and remixed in perception. So I would like to ask you maybe, can philosophy itself be written in resonance with this fractured environments? Could it echo overlaps, interferences, and dissonances, not as flaws, maybe, but as constitutive of our listening condition today? So to conclude, I'm saying that the lesson of thinking with our ears is not simply that philosophy should learn to listen as if this were an easy corrective to what it was before. It is rather that philosophy is already listened to, already sounded, that is traversed by tonalities and noises and silences and interferences it cannot master. To attend to this dimension is not to add something, but to recognize philosophy's own fragility. This fragility is not a weakness, but a condition of thought. Like the ear, which has no eyelids, philosophy is always open and always exposed. Listening thus confronts us with the impossibility of philosophical self-sufficiency, whether in Montaigne's noisy chorus, in Adorno's dissonant seismography, or in today's fractured soundscapes. So what François' book shows is that philosophy's intimacy with sound is not a new program, but a long-standing reality, one that unsettles its pretensions to clarity and mastery. To think with our ears is therefore not a task to be undertaken, as if it were a new philosophical method to be added to others, but a condition that must be acknowledged. It is a condition of a thought that is never autonomous, always traversed by resonance, always vulnerable to noise, interruption, and interference. Philosophy can neither escape nor master this condition. In this sense, to think with our ears is not to enrich philosophy, but to recognize that sound itself resounds imperfectly within the polyphony of our world. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you so much for this beautiful reading, and thank you all for being here, and to my friends. In fact, this book is a kind of a sequel of the one I wrote a long time ago. Because Ryan was already the translator of The Philosopher's Touch, it's a Columbia Press, and it was about piano practicing and the role of piano practicing in Sartre, Nietzsche, and Barthes' philosophy. Practicing, and not their theory about music, but really this was connected to their sound environment. So I would say that, yes, I was struck by the fact that in philosophy, in the history of philosophy, sound has always been very under-evaluated. Not only under-evaluated, but also dismissed. As you recall with Plato, this character of Alcibiades, showing up in the symposium, he's drunk, and so the disciples ask him to say something good about Socrates, and he says, "Oh yeah, Socrates, I'm listening to him like a flute," and they really laugh, it's ridiculous, it's stupid, meaning that, well, as soon as you are considered as a bird or a music instrument, you are on the side of animals and stupidity. So I try to understand why this reaction against sound, and of course, as you said, that's connected to the will of mastery. Because, well, if you want to control things in the world, the eyesight is okay, but hearing and listening to is connecting to passivity. There is no eyelid in your ears, so the sound, the sonic world enter your body, and that's probably what it is disturbing for these philosophers. But anyway, just to say that I try to make a kind of investigation about the role of sound and the way philosophers talked about music, about sounds, and it was sometimes funny to see that some of them, even dismissing music,
well, they were still attracted by some kind of music. For example, Hegel, listening to the barber of Sevilla. That's how you say it in English. The barber of Sevilla. And so say, oh, that's fantastic. At the same time, it was the Beethoven symphony. He didn't say anything about it, but but he said, "Wow, that's strange." But because that's like birds chirping. That's. But yeah, that's nice. There's kind of resistance against this attraction for music and sound. And but well, to be honest, we have to acknowledge that there was a kind in philosophy, a kind of auditory term with writers like with thinker like such as Montaigne. Well, I speak in front of the specialist of Montaigne here, Philippe Laforge. But what you say about the different voices, the three stages, the three steps of writing, make us hear different level, different time, and different voices. So that's why I think it's very interesting to try to listen to these voices, not only for philosophers but also for writers. The fact that when you read, you can perhaps hear a voice. A specific voice, because what's Montaigne voice? You don't know. But how do you hear something when he writes about coaches or different sounds, and what is in your mind? What do you imagine? Even if the notion of imagining that's not good, because that's kind of more of a virtual hearing. And so that's what interested me in this investigation about the role of sound in philosophy, and especially the auditory term it's well known with Nietzsche, with Schopenhauer, and more recently by also some contemporary philosophers. And Pauline is a part of this renewal of research on sound in philosophy. So just to say also, because you asked me something about the role of broadcasting philosophy, and it's true that just also for me it was very important to work with sound itself, not only music as some theoretical object. No, sound. And when you work with sound engineers, for example, you say that I'm trying to also deconstruct the notion of voice and etc. But just sound and silence, because of course that's in philosophy and also in the practice of religion. You say meditation. You say okay, it's very important to be silence. But what is exactly a silence? That's not so obvious, and I learned thanks to sound engineers that it doesn't exist as silence. There are different kind of silence, We can hear different things, from the street, and also the quality of the silence is not the same when you record in this room or in a closet, in the street. The street is never silent, but anyway, just to say that also the fact that you have to record, I don't know how to say it in English, but record it just the silent room tone. Just because, after if you do mixing, you have to find the same silent atmosphere that you recorded first, So that's, just an anecdote, but it means that for me, yes, I try to work on sound, and I also to say that I work with one of my former colleagues, Sarah Kane, who worked also on sound, more in the Middle Age, medieval studies, but anyway, it's just a way of trying to work also not only on sound, but also on listening, right? What is listening to this text or to this reference to different sounds in text. So yes, it played a role, and also to then I don't want to be too long, but just that's also an anecdote, because I was at the radio during 11 years, and at the time that there was a very important term, the digital term, because at the beginning, of my work there, there are some engineers, and they had such a good ear. This fantastic, especially to edit, to do editing, fantastic. But then there was this, application. It was more a culture of not of sound, but of seeing. You can see, that these sonograms, and and I could say that it's more easy to to do editing like that. But that's just something very different, and I could see also so different thing about the voices of the people that are invited. And it looks anecdotal, but I can tell you that it inspired me to understand that also there are some different kind of personalities in philosophy. People, according to their tone, their timbre, but also the volume. And I'm not the only one to work also in this area. David Christoffel, for example, recorded, not recorded, but used all the recordings by Foucault, and because something changed also by the fact that we can listen. So, Deleuze's voice, Lacan's voice, Foucault's voice. So he worked on Foucault, and he tried to understand the articulation, the different way of stressing the causality of certain arguments, and this is very interesting, because you can have a kind of portrait, an audio portrait of the way of demonstrating, and that's not only a question of style, that's really the matter also of their thoughts. So it played a big role.
I would like to introduce Brent Reilly, who is translator of the book. I have to say, who made a very impressive and elegant translation, very quick too. So I would like to thank him for that tonight, the opportunity of thanking him in public. He's associate professor of literature, medieval literature at Fordham University. Can you say a few words about
Yeah, actually, what you were just discussing was my favorite footnote. I remember that footnote very well, where it was on the page. Discourse. I want to say in response, but what I compare, and hopefully enter into the dialogue. So you might have had the same experience I did this morning of getting email after email from colleagues who are concerned or enthusiastic about Brian X. Chen's article in the Times about Apple's new AirPods and their seeming ability to perform simultaneous translation. The title runs, quote, "The new AirPods can translate languages in your ears." This is profound. The question that arises for me is, well, why translate? Not why have a translation, but why have a human do it? Indeed, advertisements for AI products aimed at students even seem to flirt with the question of why write, why create. François Noudelmann has called out philosophy's earplugs and the willful deafness of philosophers. I would also suggest that he helps us consider what happens when we stuff our ears with technology, leading to an insouciant deafness. What it means to hear someone seems to be changing, and the historical sweep of François' book reminds us to add, seems to be changing yet again. So my own reflections on sound today will thus relate to translating this book, to whether we can, through translation, reach the music of speech, which is, in François' words, quote, far more important than what is merely said, and to whether we can still do so when we put a machine between us and the text. English, as you may know, has labeled the translator's task with reference to carrying over, to bringing across. Translation is a transfer, translatus, being forms of the same Latin verb. I am thus meant to transfer something to you. French with its traduire is a little less hands-on, preferring to lead rather than carry, but it still does so across some divide. So in delivering this translation, my goal has been to carry over the text as written by Professor Noudelmann to you. This was not an easy task for at least two wonderful reasons. First, practically speaking, it's difficult to translate a text when you're constantly jotting down quotations from it. I would read over a paragraph and be torn between translating it into English or taking a moment to snip out a sentence or two from the original for use later. But beyond this practical, merely momentary dilemma was a greater one. To translate a book that thinks sound, I could not ignore the problem of François' voice and his sounds. Transferring his sense to you, sure, but how not to leave behind his sounds? This text lays out the problem in ways that are both challenging and comforting. In discussing the voice of Montaigne, that he hears when reading C'est les Essais, he writes, quote, "We hear Montaigne's voice, but which one? With which accent? And even if we know how certain words from that time were pronounced, we do not have the same sense of hearing to hear them with. Ears that have heard airplane engines or the electrified voices of the Rolling Stones cannot hear the sounds of nature or the voices of the young country folk like those of a 16th century reader could. Nevertheless," he continues, "we doubtless hear a voice that is Montaigne's, though fictional, of course, and based on our own, like the voice used by an actor. We fictionalize a speaking Montaigne, and we hear him speaking to us with this composite voice." He concludes, "The artifices introduced by this phonoacoustic relation of the reader to the text are redoubled in translation." Close quote. Now, a translator knows well enough these problems not to have to be reminded that the very act of translation doubles them. Still, the movement of translation thus presents an intensification of hearing, a challenge of attending to sounds at layers of remove. I'm reminded here of the discussion of the limits of translation of carrying across in Derrida's shibboleth for Paul Celan, in which, despite everything, despite the utter idiosyncratic meanings that are unrecoverable by the reader of some poem, Derrida maintains ça parle, it speaks. Somehow Montaigne speaks through his modern editions, somehow François speaks through his translation. But what are this text's sonorité? Its sounds. Is this a translation that is not just semantically faithful, but also sonically homologous to the original? Consider the sounds of syntax, a subset of the rhythms we hear across phonetic units. Here, I tried to allow François' francophone syntax to enter into the translation whenever it was at least not agrammatical to do so in English. Which is to say, I attempt as a translator, just as I prefer as a reader, translations that tend to syntactic fidelity to the source, even if at the cost of beauty in the target. Although here we need to question what we mean by beauty in relation to a translation source and target. In a series of lectures he gave late in life, the Argentine writer Borges called attention to the value of letting a source's strange sounds and structures enter a target language through translation. Syntactic uncouthness and oddity may thereby become strangeness and beauty. Hence, Borges points to the poetry of the augmentative genitive in English, Song of Songs, King of Kings, Heaven of Heavens, Holy of Holies, structures without resonance, perhaps, in the original merely superlative constructions, and certainly lacking in Martin Luther's Das Holy, which privileges his target language. It is here, perhaps, in my desire to transfer François' sounds, including the sounds of his syntax, or rather, to get out of their way, to let them pass, to let them carry over, that perhaps we could hear the difference between man and machine. When I made this translation, it was pre-public days of ChatGPT. But eventually, when limited use of the model came out, I was able to compare my translation to what generative AI could produce. Initially, the results were sufficiently mediocre on the AI's part, not on mine. So I ignored it. But the continual releasing of ever new models and the crescendo of hype, as seen in that Times article, made plugging one's ears to AI impossible. Now, when I compare my translation to one by AI, the results are much more relatable. From my unscientific sampling, I'd make the following guesstimate. More than 99% of sentences translated by AI were accurate, and of those, I still preferred mine for one reason or another 98 or 99 times out of 100. But were I to do the same today with ever-improved models, I imagine that the percentage of accurate translations would be the same, almost at ceiling, but my preference for my own translation would be ever lower. And once AI reaches near perfect accuracy and at least 50-50 preference, we will find ourselves at what I would call the translator's Turing test. And I would invoke the Turing test here not to highlight the achievement of AI in passing it, but instead to underscore the problem of listening that accompanies and is intensified by such technological achievement. This thought experiment would call our attention to differences that will go unheard. Again, achievement is not the point. Today, for example, we might perfectly say that machines think. But determining the original question, can machines think, was as meaningful or as meaningless as asking whether airplanes can fly and submarines can swim. Translation helps us avoid finding this question profound. The car is French rolls, for example, la voiture roule, but it doesn't run, la voiture court. Yet it can in English. Turing knew that in the 1950s to say machines think might sound odd, but that it might not sound so odd in the future. We could add in the future or in another language. The Turing test was never about the reality of thinking, but rather our inability to distinguish machine from human production. And here I think François' book only gains relevance in its philosophical and historical sweep. Toward the end of chapter 7, titled Acoustic Modernities and Thought Experiments, he writes, modern practices brought about by the telephone, the microphone, and the tape recorder are therefore not limited to technological progress, but have transformed the very meaning of reflection and communication. Close quote. Now that word transformed has taken on new meaning since he wrote the book. Indeed, you might use the word every day without realizing it. Chat GPT. That is to say, chat, generative, pre-trained transformers. Transformers have indeed transformed our world. They were introduced in their modern form only in 2017 in a paper out of Google titled Attention is All You Need, which was specifically an advance in machine translation. Without going into technical details, transformers generate predictions relevant to the preceding text thanks to attentional layers that allow each token in its training set to be related to other relevant tokens. What large language models do and do so well is to provide a translation accurate to the source and very, very appropriate to the target. This is a normalizing process. It hides the filtering effect of the déjà vu, of the already said, that constitutes an LLM's training set. In discussing Freud's analogy between listening analyst and telephone receiver, François notes that, quote, among these voices that we hear in the act of reading speak those of the unconscious, which is with its filters and its willful deafness. Attention-enhancing neural networks, too, have their filters, like the technological breakthroughs that filtered out the noise on telephone lines. To quote François again, software often conceals imperfections by eliminating the coughs and pauses of those speaking, even though that's where affects and latent thoughts slip through. So what gets concealed in machine translation? I can end only with questions, but I raise them thanks to reading this book, where I heard them or their echoes. Do you need a person to translate another person's sounds? What if we can't hear the difference? Attention is all you need, Google assures us. But what gets your attention? Who gets your attention? To what or to whom are we meant to attend?
Thank you so much, Brian. Well, if I may, just a question, because, well, you translated my other book, and we didn't know each other at that time. So did it change something that we know each other, you know my voice?
You know, I probably would say that the first book, I probably made it sound better in English than I did this book, which is to say that I was less concerned with maintaining fidelity to the source, as I was talking about, of that sort of syntactic rhythm, rather believing that make it accessible in the target being the focus. But instead, I'd say in round 2, and we'll see what happens in round 3, but in round 2, it was to say that there's something going on in the source that the filtering effect of making an easy translation would filter out. And your text calls out that kind of thinking in a way that made the consideration unignorable.
So, I think this is a really great translation, as Wilfried said. So happy with it. Well, sometimes, you add a note because there are something untranslatable. I would just quote, for example, I played about Derrida because, of course, with Derrida there are always puns, and I say l'accent tué de Derrida, and so it was, how can you translate l'accent tué et l'accent tué? Because, well, that's also. So it was interesting to see that you had to add a footnote to explain, how to understand this. But of course, it's also the question of the accent, because you probably remember that in the monolinguism of the other, that's the good translation of this title. I know it in French, but the monolinguisme de l'autre. Derrida said something about repressing his accent, because in philosophy, especially in French philosophy, going to France when you're Algerian and you go to France and you have to adopt a kind of standard voice. Bourdieu say also the same thing, coming from the southwest, and if you don't want to look like a peasant, at the École Normale Supérieure, you have to speak the standard French. Well, say the wonderful thing about speaking in town like that. So so it's very interesting to see that, and for me it was a lead. Derrida said, well, in fact, I tried in my oral presentation to repress my accent, but perhaps in the writing, because writing is supposed to erase all accent. I say no. In fact, there is a presence of accent in writing. So. Well, it's very hard to prove. But someone like also Glissant said the same thing. He said, I'm writing in French, but there is the Creole that you can feel in my way of speaking and writing in French. So that was important for me, yes, to understand all this orality. What we call now, and that's orality, AU, orality, and it's interesting to see that in the US Academy now there are studies about orality to understand the presence of sound, of voice in the writing. So that's why I was interested by this passage that you translated by explaining the meaning of accent tué. Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you so much for this beautiful work. So
I'd like to introduce Sylvaine Guyot. She's a professor here at NYU. And she specialized in theater from the 17th century to today. Very contemporary theater.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I begin with a very recent echo. When our colleague Hannah Fruito visited the co-seminar of the French department 2 days ago, she began by saying, "We are living in an incredibly noisy time. I long for quietness, almost in a metaphysical sense." Obviously, the noise pollution that Hannah referred to is distinct from the cacophony Maurice Schaeffer attributed to the encroaching industrial and urban development of modernity when he coined the term soundscape in 1977. It also differs from brouhaha, that flood of data that French scholar Lionel Ruffel in 2016 associated with our global world, while nevertheless viewing it as a productive force for decentering and pluralizing processes of knowledge production. Today's noise pollution is part of what François describes as, I quote, the sonic hegemony of both capitalism and totalitarianism that dominates people by channeling their listening. Conversely, freedom gets defined as having the possibility to choose one's sounds. End of quote. Thus, François' invitation to listen with care, to hear the new, to read with fresh ears comes to a particularly resonant moment, when more than ever we need to mend, to reassemble, to remember our acoustic community, as we call them. Thinking with our ears joyfully reclaims an expansive concept of sound. It has been said already, human voice, music, noise, screams, breathe, whispers, silences, vibrations, which might well be your mood fetish. I think that my écoute flottante noticed that you use it almost like 50 times in the book. But also sound beyond the acoustically realized, sound in silent reading, for instance, what Volker Ernst, the German media theorist, might call the implicit sonicity of thought and affects. Far from the extractivist listening that indigenous studies scholar Dylan Robinson warns against, your book, François, encourages that multi-perspectival listening be an active part of our relationship with the world. And as such, listening emerges as a practice of relationality, marked by an attentiveness to sound as a valuable site of circulation, exchange, and connection between people. The book resonates with me mainly as a theater scholar and theater practitioner. Obviously, due to the multisensoriality of performance, which engages both attentive listening fully and the perception of sounds that are produced not only on stage, but also around us by the audience or the building itself, sound studies and performance studies make natural companions. Not surprisingly, the book is infused with what you call the puissance acoustique du théâtre, evoking many playwrights, such as Artaud, of course, Sartre, Valérie Varina. I might come back to that if I have time. I work partly on historical periods predating the invention of recording technologies, periods that fall outside what Jonathan Stern has called the audible past. The question that your book inspired me is this, thus. With almost no first-hand accounts of what theater sounded like in 17th century France, how can we integrate the oral aspects of performance into historical theater research? How can we gauge the role of sound in shaping the audience's emotional and cognitive response at the time? And at a more methodological level, how to hear the voices that speak from historical materials? In other words, is there a way to slip into the inner ears of early modern spectators, just as François guides us in the book through the inner ears, the French says, dans le vestibule des oreilles, de certains écrivains, penseurs et lecteurs. Now, these inquiries includes actors and actresses' voices, of course, but also the sound of musical instruments, the screech of stage machinery, the rattle of candles, the boos and applaud of the audience, the screams of usher or police during stampedes that did happen in the pit, during the parterre, during performances, the whispers of bourgeois spectators passing conversations between loges. How was even directed attention or directed listening possible in such messy, chaotic, ambient soundscapes? And perhaps, I thought by reading your book, Racine's verse, famous one, pour qui sont ces serpents qui sifflent sur vos têtes? Maybe it was not only meant to evoke, as you said, the sound of a snake heard through iterations. But maybe it was made to instruct the audience not to make too much noise during the final monologue of a performance that had already lasted 2.5 hours. We are like really 30 minutes, 30 seconds before the end. So maybe that's a way just to say, keep quiet, be patient, it's almost over. Moreover, if we agree with the colonial philosopher Rodrigo Toro and Donovan Hernandez Castellanos, who argue that the subject should be conceived as, I quote, a sonating body that vibrates collectively with other bodies when inhabiting a physical space together, then how did, in the 17th century, sound waves emanate from people? How were they absorbed by their bodies and muffled? Or, on the contrary, how did they bounce and refract? Was that physics of sound waves different in the pit where people stood versus the lodge, where we don't even know how many people would squeeze in the space? And what about when the king attended the performance? And what happened also when the seats for aristocratic spectators were removed from the stage in 17? Anyway, so the sonic approach to theatre's past brings new perspective and focus, obviously. Not only it challenges the primacy of the written text as archive, but it also demands a holistic understanding of theater performance as a total social fact, with its material determinations and sociological contingents. But thinking sonically also orients us to question what I would call our sonic imaginations of the past. That is to say, the politics embedded in our relationship to history. Departing from any transhistorical or transcultural essentialism, your book, François, illuminates what you call the acoustic revolutions. It is actually the title of one section. Those acoustic revolutions that differentiate the way we hear and listen across time. And I have actually like the same quote that the one Brian gave, and that I also really like. We hear Montaigne's voice, but which one? Blah, blah, blah. And even, it's just like people heard. Even if we know how certain words from that time were pronounced, we do not have the same sense of hearing to hear them with. Ears, I love that sentence, that have heard airplane engines and the electrified voices of the Rolling Stones, I cannot hear like those of a 16th century reader. And yes, my field. Research in 17th century theater has, for the past 2 decades, been largely dominated by the HIP, the historically informed performance movement. And as a footnote, I see Ariane Botex-Ferrand, our colleague, who could elaborate more on this than I can. I just said that the questions posed in this field differ radically between musicology and theater studies. So what is HIP? Very quickly, it reconstructs pronunciation, cadence, pauses, and speed of the déclamation baroque, alongside the legible and intelligible gestures that were supposedly systematically associated with the theatrical speech. In doing so, HIP invites modern audiences to listen, as audiences did in the early modern period, to experience what it might be to have attended, to have participated, to have lived at that moment of time. True, HIP played a significant role in the material term of early modern theatre studies, shifting scholars' attention to the physicality of performance, but it has also contributed to a persistent political fiction in French national literary history, the myth of a sublime and universal sourdine classique, that of a grand siècle of reason, rules, and harmony that transcends times and culture. So the question is not really, can we, in fact, hear with the ears of the past? And to be honest, HIP people do not pretend to reconstruct the exact event. They position themselves as a form of speculative history. But the question is, what does it mean to omit or erase all the surrounding noises of the assembly in which theater plays were socially produced and consumed? What does it mean to erase also the layers of the auditory memories, as you call them, that have accumulated around these works of art as they crossed time. And to paraphrase François, changing a little bit the sentence, any listening through its mode of attention is inscribed in a political relation to sonic histories. And since I've read you, I have like this obsessional question. What is the right way to make her the final monologue of Bering's Racine's? Is it with the manly tone that, as Sarah Nancy has shown, female performers were trained to adopt because a woman's voice would otherwise be perceived as too seductive? Or with what we can only imagine might have been Racine's own voice when he rehearsed the verses he had just written, declaiming them as a test in the Jardin du Luxembourg, surrounded by workers who would throw stones at him, thinking, "Oh, this crazy guy." Or with the silences shaped by colonial history, such as those silences of Congolese children who were forced to learn French through the study of the neoclassical canon in school, as Faustin Linekula, a Congolese choreographer, staged in his decolonial adaptation of the play. Or, and then I stop, like Isabelle Huppert, with a kind of geste souffle, to borrow one of your beautiful terms, as though we must acknowledge that something is forever lost in the canon, or maybe rather that Zulu voices and power relations have sedimented in the canon, that it has become, in a way, unutterable, unexpressive. And here perhaps I'm getting to the end, like the connection with my work on contemporary theater. Because that is, one of my other obsessions is why are we so determined to recover the supposedly true voices of the past stage, while at the same time, and this is often the same people, we tend to resist when contemporary artists accept the right to tell their own stories on stage with the brain of their own voices. This leads me to one final word, maybe a sort of a return to the sonic reverberations of our troubled times. Our sense today of acoustic saturation compels us, I feel, to question and acknowledge the boundaries that allow the recognition of some voices, some sounds over other. For example, the sound of a gun over the sound of bombs. What is audible depends not only on the listener's capacity to listen, but also on what is deemed valuable enough to be given audibility, and what is not allowed to be heard in a society, on what kind of access to listening is permitted, and to whom, and how we are trained, and I put you in the final page, I think, how we are trained to attend to one noise rather than other, to prioritize certain sounds. A call to change or to unsettle our institutions of listening, that is, at least for me, and at least today, like right now, the call I hear in your more than timely advocacy for a multiplication of ears. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvaine, for this discussion. And there is a lot to say and for our next discussion for sure. So just to say something about noise, but you open so many dossiers, but there's the question of noise, the question of soundscape that we could discuss also with Pauline, with exactly the soundscape, well, the noise of stones, the voice of this writer reading aloud. Anyway, so just to say something about the voices from the past, that have been recorded. I think that yes, there is also a political stake in this way of highlighting certain specific voices. And for example, I'm thinking of Laforge's work that was so important to, for example, on the 18th century, for example, to focus on unheard voices. Because, well, how to know exactly what was the soundscape of the 18th century in Paris? It's very hard. What kind of archives can you use? And she wrote wonderful studies about the scream in the streets, and the voices of the people, and not only the voice of the king or the messenger from the king, and but really trying to make unheard voices listened. I think this is there is a political thing in this way of investigate in this sound, these dirty sounds. So that's very important. And dirty sounds, what is a dirty sound? It's noise. Noise is the word to say dirty sounds, but well, there is no noise, there's only sounds, well, I know that in music there is that noise, but well, it's not my favorite music, but yeah, it's important to acknowledge, to recognize the value of all different sounds. So just coming back to the soundscape, to use this Murray Schafer expression, that is a bit problematic, as we know, because there is still this hierarchy between the sound of nature, because nature of course is not silent, but the sound of nature, and the modernity that is of course made of noise, but thanks to also contemporary, modern composer, we know that sounds can be a very important matter in music, sirens and many things, and so there is problematic hierarchy between these different kind of sounds. But just to say that, I thank you for stressing that I try to not isolate sound, because sound is never alone. Sound is always connected to something else. So, for example, we are in this room and we have different things that we can hear now. Some people in the street, and we associate. So first, we could say we associate. We associate what we are listening to, Sylvain's tone, my tone, and perhaps we are not aware of that, but it's part of the understanding. There is a very interesting comments by Wittgenstein about that. Say, we're in a room, we read a book, but there is a sound. It's not an accident. It's not also just an association. It's a composition, and we constantly compose with all what is around us in our environment, with image, with sound, and it's the part of our reading. We must give credit to this role of sound constantly around us. So meaning that yes, there are the sound is always in relation with something else than sound. So that's important. And coming back to thought and thinking with our ears, I think that we can understand that there are different soundtracks when we think, and the art of perhaps thinking or writing is to do mixing, to mix between the different soundtracks we have in our mind. Soundtracks perhaps sometimes in our subconscious or it's in the physical environment, but it's a part of our thoughts. There is no, abstract thought without word, without sound. It's a meaning. We work constantly and we think constantly and we read also constantly with these different soundtracks made of voices, of memories, of sounds. That's what I tried to investigate in this book.
So, last but not least, Simon Lesser, he's a PhD candidate in the Department of French Literature, Art and Culture, and a fellow at the Center for the Humanities at NYU, and a social translator. Hence, his presentation, I think.
Yes, I'll talk a bit about translation as well. Thank you very much for having me. It's truly a pleasure to speak with François, in part because I first read Français avec les oreilles right before applying to this department in the PhD program. So it's very fitting that I would now get to talk about it in its translation in what hopefully will be my final year here at the department. So, I mean, in preparation for this talk, I looked at the notebook I had at the time and what I'd written down for myself about François' book, and I noticed two important things, really. First, the prevalence of the name Proust, and I did remember how much In Search of Lost Time is brought up throughout the book and comes to be evoked as something of a great, if not the great novel of noise. François mentions relevant passages on earplugs, on motor cars, Proust and his asthmatic style, and of course on the telephone and theatrical phone. But there was another word I found written down, which was a little more unexpected, at first kind of perplexing, and that's the word traduction, which I found underlined next to a mostly unreadable page number. And I didn't really remember until I reread, or in fact read the translation Thinking with Our Ears, quite how much this is a text that is inhabited by translation. And I don't just mean that, I read the text as a translation. You're great. Obviously, your translation is great, Brian. But the questions of translation keep reappearing throughout it. The translation of voice or vocal posture into text, more widely of paralinguistic elements, accents, say, into linguistic ones, but also sound into meaning, music into noise, silence into sound, acoustic phenomena into visual language, etc. If thinking with our ears is the point, our heading in this book, often enough it's acts of translation that are the means by which this thinking is produced. And so throughout this reading or rereading exercise, I was stuck wondering about the act of translating with one's ears, and what that might mean. The most obvious and relevant such instance in the book is when François writes on soundscape, the concept popularized by Murray Schafer, already discussed, which is at the root of sound studies. François writes of the shortcomings of its French translation, paysage sonore, a phrase that makes unfortunately clear, if not enforces, a separation between the acoustic and visual terms which make up the word soundscape. Now, in Brian's English version of François' text, the paysage sonore had to be translated to English again. What we get is therefore an intralingual translation. A soundscape is turned into sonic landscape. The component words of soundscape are spilled out into the open. A blend word like soundscape is also known in English by the French loanword portmanteau, meaning coat rack. In French, blend words are mots valises, instead word suitcases. And there's maybe the implication in the French, at least, that words like soundscape are merely a means for travel, meant to be open and picked apart at destination. The paysage sonore or sonic landscape in that case is merely a record then of the arrival of Murray Schafer's concept at a destination, a record of its interpretation. Coat rack, by contrast, maybe reminds of the very act of traveling with a blend word means picking it apart, that choices have to be made as to which coat can be worn on the way out. I'm imagining a rack with many old coats on it. The commonplace in translation discourse has it that sound is a thing that is inevitably lost in translation. That the semantic demands of a translation of a text from one language to another makes sound into the foremost untranslatable. The exact acoustic arrangement of expression does not fit in the word suitcase. Paysage sonore is neither soundscape nor sonic landscape. Equivalence, not equality, is the principle by which translation operates. Sounds are reduced to acoustic signs, are important not in themselves, but in what they accentuate or are made to mean within their linguistic context. And so when Proust's narrator, reading in his room in Swansway with the window open, overhears in the street below des coups frappés dans la rue de la Cure par Camus contre des caisses poussiéreuses, his English translator, Scott Moncrief, simply cannot keep the alliterations. When the English reader reads this passage, what we get instead are blows struck down below in the Rue de la Cure by Camus upon some dusty packing cases. Scott Moncrief instead packs Proust's alliterations further on at the very end of that very long sentence, transforming what those noises in the street evoke in a narrator's imagination, which, and I quote, seem to scatter broadcast a rain of blood-red stars. And this is a clear embellishment on Proust's own sentence. Il semblait faire voler au loin des astres écarlates. Now, his detractors would say that Scott Moncrief adds to the original, changes it. They're not entirely wrong, but he's also making up a sort of debt incurred on the original, which he felt absolutely needed to be repaid. And this is the economy of translation as equivalence. In that regard, the word soundscape itself is a mess, but it's its very messiness that gets lost when it is translated into sonic landscape. The acoustic and the visual sit awkwardly next to one another. There is no real acoustic equal to landscape, just an uneasy likeness. The acoustic experience is brought in to fill a space, become an atmosphere, a scenery. The listener is presented with a spatial arrangement of sounds related to objects seen or unseen, which they can rearrange. We can move birds here, move cars there, but in which the individual sounds cannot be changed in themselves, cannot be played like instruments. The listener, like the onlooker, is made to stand as if at a remove from the phenomenon. As François explains, the turn towards the study of sound, or the sound studies rather, was a turn towards the study of acoustic phenomena that were not or could not be systematized musically, which were not translated into musicological terms. But something was also lost in that exchange, in the move away from music. I think a sort of temporality that emerges in the systematized succession of sounds, the movement through time that is absent from soundscape and is inherent to the definition of music. This movement is the Bewegung of tonal forms in Hanslick's definition, the dialectical Bewegung of interpretation for Adorno, the experience of movement itself. The whole school of contemporary philosophers of music, some of whom have in fact quarreled. I'm thinking here of Malcolm Budd and Roger Scruton, on whether even employing the term movement, and especially Bewegung, German, is not already introducing a spatializing metaphor into the mix, which denatures the musical experience. What I mean to say by this and by the introduction of movement is that music wholly resists visualization. It exists in time. It is not contained by the musical text, by notation, which is merely an imperfect equivalence, an abstract visual translation of the musical phenomenon. The score is not read or listened to, not the repository of a pristine musical experience. Rather, it is the performance of the score that makes the music, which is to say that music is produced at interpretation. And so translating with our ears in this sense is also therefore translating against the comforts of equivalence, superseding of that equivalence in the act of interpretation. It's not an interpretation evaluated in its ability to grasp at a unique, original arrangement of sounds, but interpretation in the sense of a performance, one among many, a setting of the text in motion, enacted by a translator-interpreter with an eye on what's lost, an egalitarian gesture perhaps toward the work as it exists in performance rather than on the page. And I wonder if just such a performer, kind of translator-interpreter, is not what I detect in the English version of the title, Penser avec les oreilles, thinking with our ears, which translates the disembodied article-led les oreilles with the possessive adjective our ears, which seems to me kind of claim to interpretation rather than equivalence.
Thank you so much for this. Just want to say that, yeah, we would like everything possible that it will be your last year, even if we will miss you a lot. And because Simon is also a translator, and he needs dissertation. He works on this question of sound in translation, what is lost, and I just would like to say that, you know, I was happy to see that, well, how to see it, you know, because of Derrida and the focus on the archi-écriture and the dismissal of the myth of voice, the presence, metaphysical presence. So, well, it prevented us to work on sound and voice because on the metaphysics de la présence. So, and well, the new generation, they didn't have this taboo, you know, comments. But I think that Brian should respond to give perhaps an answer to what has been said about this back and forth, especially about the discussion of soundscape.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I think there's another one, the milieu sonore.
Yeah.
What was perhaps the most vexing of the translation, because if you just did it with the cognate sonic milieu, that doesn't kind of sound quite like sonic environment, which is sort of a more neutral sense of living. And then later on in the book, when environnement is put to the side, it doesn't work. Let's fully charge milieu with its full sense. That's when in English it should be earned. And then the question became, prior to earning it in the text, when you said milieu sonore, was that sonic milieu already, or was it just sonic environment? The only thing I'll add, and the funny thing that you bring up alliteration, is I added one to the text. And this is the problem with, as you mentioned, the footnote before explaining the pun. And I think it's in Le Grain de la Voix, Bart's text, where he said, when you say, I'm listening, it very quickly becomes listen to me. Right. So you know, as a translator, it was absolutely the goal, the intention to transfer your voice, but the translator sneaks their voice in.
Yeah. So just perhaps a last word to say that yes, I think we must be aware of this the role of sound, and but not only in our life, but also thinking in terms of ecology. You know, why is it so important to find the good notion, you know? And I know many of you here that work on the ecology. We know that's where environment, meaning that's where it's only around us, but no, we are part of what we call the environment. That's why it's not so good, and that's why also atmosphere, milieu are different notions that make possible to understand that. Yes, we are part of this sonic milieu sonore, and that we must be aware of the way of thinking through, but well, both in our inner ears, but also from outside. We constantly are in a kind of composition. As I said with this Wittgenstein's comment, it's a composition. That's not just an accident, just an association with different kind of different sounds, noise, virtual noise, memories. There are also the past voices are still haunting, our way of thinking and our way of perceiving the world. So that's all this matter, and it's very, of course, it's huge. But I think just, I think that the goal also of this book is not only to think to talk about sound in philosophy, but also to be aware and to focus on the role of sound in our ecology, in our milieu sonore. I think that's it's also a political question to focus on the unheard voices. So it has different level of reward. That was my. That were my different goals. But well, do you have time for some question, or is it?
Yeah, I think we have time for we have 20 minutes. Okay, fine.
Thanks everyone for this fascinating discussion of morality, all kinds of philosophical directions. So, François, I'm sure you know that these days, if you're teaching philosophy or literature, say to undergraduates, a large percentage of students will prefer to listen to the books and audiobooks rather than read them. Do you think that's a good thing?
First of all, you have to know that there is a big difference between France and the English-speaking world, because audiobooks they are not very fashioned in France. You know that it's useful, but it's more for old people. You know.
Very old.
Yeah, but I know that in the US and in the UK, it's very important. There's such a big market of the audiobooks. Why didn't I say something correct? That's good. Yeah. So just to say that, I think it's very interesting. Well, what is fascinating for me is that today, because there was a time as a publisher, you could choose a great actor reading, Carole Bouquet reading Derrida, for example. So, wow, it's great, but now, well, it's too costly to hire great actors, so AI can do it perfectly. And it's fascinating to see how you can choose your voice. You can choose the rhythm, the speed, but also the timbre. And you want I don't know, if I would like to hear, to listen to Carole Bouquet or to, I don't know who, but anyway, I can choose the kind of timbre and also this, Q voice, non-gender voice. So there is such, many opportunities to deal with the voice we like. And, I don't know if I can say it, but Wilfried told me that now with the ChatGPT, the last version, in his car, he's constantly speaking with someone. And for example, I don't know if
you can get bored when I drive.
the leaps and sounding about. You can run a philosophical dialogue. We can ask, well, could you read some sentence by Montaigne? That's fascinating. So I cannot say it's good or it's not good. I say it's what it is. So it changes a lot, and it's a way perhaps scary, but also fascinating.
There's a lot of artists who listen to audiobooks when they are in the studio. I was at the opening yesterday and said, yeah, when I work, I'm listening to audiobooks because I don't have time to read.
So Wilfried is a specialist of Adorno. I don't know what Adorno would inform about it. Yeah, me too, right, for sure. Yeah. The fetishist man.
Thank you. Lots to think about here. You said one thing that I'm very curious about. You said it's helpful to acknowledge the value of all sounds. And thinking with Nietzsche on this, and especially like his especially late life obsession with, I mean, he characterizes Twilight, the beginning of Twilight, as he characterizes the reevaluation of all values as a sounding out of idols, striking them with a tuning hammer as with a tuning fork. I'm curious how, when this gets talked about, like it's very, I'm in this world of sound studies, like, oh, it's very fun to be like, oh, the resonances and like we need to listen to the voice and blah, blah, blah. But so does the sonic milieu precede its recognition as sound? Because it seems like something in that, for Nietzsche, that would be like a very normalizing version of whatever existence could be. So like, how do we understand the sonic milieu? Is it a sonic milieu prior to it being sounded to, coming to consciousness or something like that? It's maybe a weird question, but I'm curious thinking about it with Nietzsche, as you mentioned.
Thank you for this very provocative question. Interesting. And I would say, focusing on all sounds and noise, and trying not to dismiss noise. It's not a way to say, well, all sounds are great, and we must admit that yes, everything is of importance, and that's the same thing with relativism in Nietzsche, because Nietzsche is not relativist at all. So there are different interpretations, but they are bad or good interpretation for him. But coming back to sound and music in Nietzsche's work, I'm glad that you remind us the tuning fork, because in the philosopher's stone, I propose to think of this tuning fork not as hammer. When you say, well, I'm a philosopher with a hammer, the tuning fork is the hammer. But where does it come? My suggestion that it comes from the piano, the hammers of the piano, not the hammer like Michel Onfray used it to say, I'm Nietzschean, I have to destroy everything, or Gilles, anyway. So, no, hammer is tuning fork. So the tuning fork is to find a good tune, but you can, well, what was the sentence? You can hit a philosophical system with this tuning fork, and you can hear if it's good, if it's bad. So that's really a way of sorting, the interesting or the nocive, the toxic.
The most bloated idols, I think, is one thing he says. The fat-headed, most bloated idols.
Yeah. Well, I think we could agree on that.
Merci.
Gino? There are two things I think that I notice in technology in terms of sound. One is an old technology that you can go to a movie now and watch it with subtitles. So you hear the sounds. Let's say I watch a French movie and my French is at best mediocre. And yet I can get a translation so I can still hear the sounds and the actors' voices as they perform, but I'm not lost in the meaning because I have something in English that guides me. And the other thing is very modern with the AI, which is they're now capable of translating non-human sounds. For example, whales or dolphins or apes or elephants, and they take those sounds and they can find some sort of translation or pattern that corresponds to the way our brains might think about communications. Who knows which directions we'll head in going forward.
Thank you. It's very interesting. I do comment, it's very interesting. Yeah. It's very important. So, sorry, because I agree with you. So perhaps Gino wanted to ask something. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for this wonderful conversation. And I'm looking forward to reading this book. And from my experience as a musicologist and musician, vocalist, and I find very interesting what you were saying about talking about the audio. I don't know if it speaks to you, coming back from my own experience, reading a book in the past. When I was staying with my parents, my father was a Latinist. There were more books than anything else in the house. So I wasn't into books, but I was reading the books only to see the melody, the rhythm. I was hearing some stuff. I was hearing melody, rhythm, colors, I was seeing a bunch of stuff. But it wasn't because the story was great. It was because of the way how do you call it? The way people were phrasing, the writing. The writing was talking to me. Yeah, I just want to know would you say that it's something thinking with ears, it's something idiosyncratic or proper to each individual or something cultural, do you see any relationship with
So Gino is a musicologist, a musician, and he's can I say multi-voiced? Yeah, I'm always fascinated by people that can have so many voices. That's something we are working on in a seminar about how to lose your tongue in the different voices. But anyway, and by the way, I want to advertise because Gino will do a lecture soon on sung and spoken voice. When is it? What's the The third. Yes, 30th. So please come back. I would say that for everybody, there's it's not idiosyncratic. I think that everybody. Even if you could say, sorry, I don't hear anything. But I think that it's in our mind, it's in our environment, it's constantly. I think that's we live in a milieu sonore, for sure. So even when we try to escape from this milieu sonore, we are constantly immersed in this milieu sonore. So it means that we are constantly dealing and composing with this milieu sonore, and that's why for me I wanted to investigate in the way some thinkers try to pay attention to this sound, either by saying, I cannot work for example, Schopenhauer saying, this slamming the doors, slamming the door is really a proof of stupidity, or the dogs barking, this obsession of sounds. But others, like, we say Nietzsche, Nietzsche, when it was in Sylvaine Guyot at the beginning of writing, so Zarathustra, so spoke Zarathustra. That's spoke Zarathustra, sorry. And he said, there is a kind of tune in my ear, and it accompanied him constantly, when you were was traveling to like Coaro, Genova, Nizza. There's this constant, we don't know what it is, you know. It was not a Wagnerian thing, for sure, that song. But well, and then he said that that's called Safra was a sort of symphony. And, you know, what it is, it's this big poem, it's philosophy, it's, and for him it was just music. So, you know, I think that's, it's also interesting to, even if it's a bit difficult to understand what it means, and what was this tune, but it played a big role in his abstract, not abstract, but in his philosophical writings.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe a last question.
Please, I didn't read the book, but I'm from the Bronx when it's Raymond, and I live on Jerome. I'm by elevated train number 4. So for me, sound is constantly in my head, mostly all the time when I'm in my apartment. So I close the window, and I say, fuck the sound of some, but it's still there. So the only way I know how to calm my nerve and my mind sometimes is after like 1 o'clock when the train stops slowing up, and then I'm able to even hear the tick of my clock. So I say, well, I'm back in my insanity, in my own calmness. But then I think about, well, you know, they say the human brain only can hear a certain sound wave compared to like certain animals, dogs and dolphins. So I say, well, I'm not in that type of realm, so I guess I'm not that bad off. So thank you.
Actually, it's not a question, but just thoughts that came up was that the more there's silence, the more you can hear your blood. So you can hear the pumping of your blood if you're in a sensory fog. And with your description of the theater, I was thinking how much clothing must have made a noise in the audience because they had so many layers. So just like trying to sit still without making noise, there would be a lot of rustling. Yes, I'm going to read the book. I can't. But the blood.
Philip? So, the last one. The very last one.
I'll be brief. Firstly, thank you, François, for a great book, which I read a few years ago, but this panel really reactivated the book. It was a great panel. Every one of you really brought something to it, and I think made it feel like a really relevant book, especially right now, and a really hopeful book in a way. And so I was teaching Montaigne this afternoon, and we came across a sentence in De l'Oisiveté, which is l'âme qui n'a point de but établi, virgule, elle se perd. And so the question was asked of me, well, why does he say that? And so I started to explain what he means, right? And then it was, no, that's not what I mean. Why does he say l'âme qui n'a point de but établi, elle se perd, and not l'âme qui n'a point de but établi, se perd? And it reminded me that I should have been thinking with my ears. It was all about the rhythm of the sentence. And, we know this about Montaigne in the way that, the Exemplaire de Bordeaux, he, introduced lots of new punctuation. He tried to make it as choppy as possible and to really make his voice sort of hearable. And so I think your book is just really important right now in terms of teaching us how to teach, getting us away from precisely the question of AI, right? You can't ask what this is about because it's not about something that can be summarized. It's not about the ideas. It's about listening to it. And so I think it opens up lots of ways for teaching differently, for getting students to read things out, creating their own audiobooks maybe as a way of like refining the voices in the text, but also, about sort of scholarly practices. Strangely takes us back to a more old-fashioned way. Like, we need to actually have editions with punctuation and write books about punctuation and la virgule chez Proust. Maybe that is actually really important after all. And I think your book really sort of brings that out. So I just wanted to say thank you to you, François, and everybody. It was a great panel. Thank you.